Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Uh, on behalf of IBFNet, Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome to all the participants. Today's webinar is a very interesting one, keeping people safe during humanitarian action and intersectional approach. And today we have a very eminent speaker, a well-known face in the field, Dr. Amjad Saleem. Dr. Amjad is the manager of volunteering, youth, and education development at IFRC, which is the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, which, as you know, is the world's largest humanitarian network in Geneva. He oversees global policy and programs for its 191 national societies, including the Global Youth Mobilization Project. A research fellow at the University of Malaya, Malaysia, he has experience in humanitarian work, interfaith engagement, and peace building. He serves as a trustee for Muslim Aid UK, board member of Geneva Peace Building Platform, People Beyond Borders, and EduSpots. His publications include a book, Lessons from Aceh, and several articles and chapters. Dr. Amjad holds a Master of Engineering from Imperial College, an MBA from Manipal Global Next University, Malaysia, and a PhD from Exeter University. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Amjad to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ubaidullah. It's nice to be once again cooperating with you after a while of us going off on different paths. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and a very good morning from here in Geneva, but maybe good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are in the world. Just wanted to check that I'm audible, so people can hear me. If you can't hear me, just please unmute or send me a sign, and we'll be happy to kind of sort out my audio issues. So today I was invited to talk a bit about some of the things that we're doing around humanitarian work, and one of the things I thought would be interesting for us to look at is this aspect of keeping safe from harm, and particularly looking at violence and exclusion in humanitarian work. And the reason why we do that is because the rationale is that actually humanitarian work, aid, provision, can be a source of good. It can also be a source of harm. And it's important to actually recognize that. And often we don't actually understand that sometimes, we can exacerbate a situation if we're not careful, if we're not aware to doing things that are good, that we think that are good, but actually could end up being harmful. And the reason being is that if we do not understand the context in which we're operating, if we do not understand the dynamics that is there, we actually can exacerbate existing tensions and problems, or we could actually create new tensions and problems. And so when we talk about doing humanitarian work, when we talk about engaging with the communities and understand, we have to do it within the sense of understanding the context in which we are operating. Right? You can't go into a context without understanding specifically what are some of the challenges that what are some of the drivers of conflict, what are some of the issues that are related to the tensions. How is it that whatever we're doing is not exacerbating further harm? And often, we go in with good intentions, we go in with a sense of passion and purpose to actually do things. But often those things are not necessarily enough if we have not ourselves understood how we engage with the communities, how we are understanding the challenges that are there. And so it is important for us when we go into a situation where there's a humanitarian crisis, whether it's conflict or whether it's man-made or what is, a disaster, that we have a good understanding of the context. We have a good understanding of the community. We're trying as much as possible to ensure that there's the do no harm perspective. So that's the kind of first aspect of it, right? So if we want to keep people safe from harm, obviously, if when there's a disaster or conflict, there's already harm been committed on them. And the question for us is, how do we ensure that no further harm is exacerbated? And so there's an element, the first element of this is actually understanding the context, understanding how the community or that context, which is dynamic, can change. How do the communities engage with each other? Particularly if there are different communities based on faith or ethnicity or class or whatever. Understanding the external push factors and the internal pull factors. What does this look like? What are the understanding that the context itself changes on a regular basis, and particularly during times of a humanitarian crisis will continuously change. But we need to understand that context. So if you don't understand that context, you could go in and exacerbate further challenges and tensions. For example, you could go into a context and sort of say, well, there's two communities that are there. One, and let's take an example of a conflict. Maybe there's a conflict in a particular part of a country where there's two communities from different ethnic groups that are there. One community is from the majority, one community is from the minority. Yet the minority, the ones who are deemed as the victims of the conflict. And so you go in to provide additional humanitarian assistance to these people, which is absolutely what you need to do. But then you don't recognize that because of that conflict, that particular part of the country has also witnessed a strain in terms of resources coming in, economic, financial, human, and all of that thing. And so that country, that part of the country, is already suffering a strain and a vulnerability. And so whilst the minority community that is the direct victims of this conflict is suffering, the majority community that is also around it is also suffering because they're not getting resources in it. And so there's an indirect effect from that conflict. Yet because there's an assumption that they're the majority community, they'll be looked after, you go in and you only look after the minority community. You could exacerbate a tension with the majority because the majority kind of see this thinking that only the minorities are being looked after and they're not being looked after. And so you could exacerbate or you could create a new tension that is there. And you can do the same at various levels. So the idea of doing a context analysis is important for us to understand the community, understand how we as potentially outsiders coming in with support, with work, can influence those dynamics, can change that context, can make things better or worse. Sometimes humanitarian or agencies go in, and of course they have to employ people to help them to deliver their aid, and so they employ them. And because they have slightly bit of funding, maybe they provide jobs that are better in terms of pay than what people would get in that normal context. So suddenly there's a demand to work for these humanitarian agencies because the pay is good. Yet, what does that create when it comes to the demand and supply of jobs, particularly, for example, if the project is a temporary project and then the humanitarian organization leaves that area. And so when they leave that area, the job's finish. And what happens if you have someone who, for example, has been earning double or triple his pay with the humanitarian agency? And then once that agency leaves, has to find a job in the local dynamics. So it's important to have that understanding and to be aware of those sensitivities. The other aspect of the context analysis is the do no harm. And this is almost a minimum requirement. In fact, some people say that the do no harm is actually the minimum that needs to be done. And actually we need to strive to do as good as we can, but recognizing that there's a number of things there. So the do no harm principle is effectively that we do not inadvertently increase tensions, and we do not create adverse impacts. And so if we take the do no harm principle, and if we take the sort of context analysis, what we're saying is that there are minimum of six dynamics that could affect the context. And the one that I will really focus on is the first one, because this is where it's often not understood, because things like urbanization, resilience, access, climate, conflict, all of those things are things people think about. People don't necessarily think about the issue of exclusion, who's excluded and how people are excluded. And, there's often a business. So that's what I wanted to kind of focus on today. But it's important to understand that these dynamics affect your context, could affect how you're doing a humanitarian response, how these dynamics affect the relationships, the societal cohesion there, and it's important for us to understand that. But I really want to focus on the first one, which is the exclusion. How are we excluded? How if we are not aware of the challenges of exclusion, the challenges of gender diversity, we may have unintended consequences that can exacerbate and create more harm. And so that we talk about an approach to context analysis. We talk about doing a contextualized approach to issues around violence prevention and inclusion. We need to look at the immediate risks and consequences of exclusion and the causes of those risks. So when we do that analysis, when you have to understand the community, you have to understand what are the violence risks, what are the exclusion risks, what are the causes of those risks and the consequences of those risks. And this comes from a thorough analysis of how people's identity, and I'm going to stress this very much, with the identity, whether it's gender, whether it's disability, whether it's age, whether it's faith, whatever, affect their vulnerability to harm and exclusion. And this is something that not only is for humanitarian context, but also for a development context. Now, the reason why we go into that depth, because often when you think about a community and you think about him, you kind of think, okay, that this community has been affected and we need to go in, provide assistance. In one sense, it is. But in another sense, if you're not aware of the intricacies of that perspective, you may be creating more harm. And so what I'm trying to sort of say today is that we need to have a better analysis how even within a community, you have to have a better understanding of those dynamics, of those intersecting issues of diversity, identity, because that affects their vulnerability to crisis and to exclusion, to violence and to exclusion. And the reason why we say that is that crisis is not gender and diversity neutral. In fact, crises have different impacts on women, men, boys, girls, the elderly, the disabled, and all of that. And this goes back to that everyone has different needs and concerns. Even on this call today, in this webinar, the 12 of us who are here, if we were physically in a place together and there was a crisis that took place, a humanitarian crisis that took place, a flooding or whatever, I guarantee that between the 12 of us, we will have different ways that crisis affects us and how we respond to it. Because we have different needs, we have different concerns. We may even have different abilities in terms of our physical and mental capacities. And as a consequence, if you're not cognizant of those different needs and importantly, the different coping strategies, then you are exacerbating vulnerability, and you are exacerbating potential for exclusion. And as a consequence, you're exacerbating the potential for harm to be emphasized even more. As we know, in most cases, we often see that the most vulnerable are affected by a crisis, and that could be definitely elderly, women, girls. But in some cases, it can be men and boys. In some cases, it is disabled, or what the distinction even within the disability community of the physical versus the intellectual. We know that sexual gender-based violence often increases at times of emergencies. But it's not often the case, although majority of the times it is, that it is women and girls who suffer. We often find that men and boys also suffer because their vulnerabilities are different, or because we assume their capacity to cope is stronger or different, and as a consequence, we don't focus on them. And so it's important that we look at these things, and it's important that we sort of look at some of the indirect aspects of it. So, for example, we often have programs that, obviously, when we have a disaster, we will often have your livelihood is disrupted, your daily life is disrupted, gender roles are flipped. And often we have programs that come in to sort of say, okay, fine, you know what, we need to look specifically at women and girls because it's important. And so as a consequence, we focus on programs on women and girls, which is needed. But sometimes because of that, it flips that domestic role that has been there. And often you have increased tendencies for substance abuse or domestic violence. Often in times of crisis, early marriage is considered as a way of families to protect their daughters. But these can often be causes of sexual gender-based violence. So it's important to first of all just understand those risks, understand the variety of people that are in our community with various needs and concerns, understand that it's not a blanket response to how we do things, but to understand a much more nuanced perspective of that. Which then leads me to my other point, which is around understanding what inclusion is. Because in order for us to understand how people are, why people are excluded, and what are some of the identity points, we need to understand inclusion. And it's really around reducing inequalities based on different perspectives on social backgrounds, identity, power relations. It's based on understanding that we need to provide inclusive services to give resources to all. And this is where the concept of intersectionality comes up. And some of you may have heard this word because it's been used particularly in the anti-racism sphere. But it's also important for us to kind of bring it in here, which is that different people have, every one of us has several layers to our identity. And actually, the propensity for harm to be committed on you and the scale of which that harm can be committed on you is because of a combination of these different factors. So, I mean, here are some kind of listing your gender, ethnic origin, nationality, citizenship, age, disability. All of these things are aspects of the identity that are woven together. So there's several layers. Amartya Sen talks about having multiple identities, right? And he says those multiple identities strengthen who you are, right? And so you are not the sum of just one person. You are not just someone from a country or of a particular faith. You are there because those multiple identities help you to express yourself, help you to create a worldview, a sense of who you are, a position in this on this earth, and your thoughts. So discrimination actually happens because there's an attack on these combination of factors. And so when we think about an intersectional perspective of addressing this, of inclusion, of ensuring no one is left behind and no one is left outside, and ensuring that we have a better understanding of who the community is, that we need to understand that we need to look at these different intersecting combinations of identities, the forms of discrimination that you can look at, to understand the compound effects in the individual, to understand how we can actually look at this in a holistic manner. So what does this mean, the importance of looking at forms of discrimination together and at the same time compound effects on the individual? So let's take an example. So this is a community. This is a community. They have access to resources, opportunities, and rights. Within this community, like any other community, there will be those people who are excluded, who don't have those same access to resources and opportunities and rights. We sort of look at that as structural causes of inequality, of exclusion. And often, there are, within those perspectives, they are what we call the cultural causes of exclusion. So even within those who are excluded from society because of structural causes, there's a further exclusion from them, from those people because of culture. So what does this mean? So this means that if we take a structural cause of exclusion from society, of access to, it could be long-term unemployment. Traditionally, this is seen as dominant ethnic males who are middle-aged. That means the majority community of that society is the one that suffers from this. Could be homeless because of a number of things. And again, this is traditionally male, but often they're educated, they're healthy, but for whatever reason, they're faced in exclusion. It could also be uneducated, who has no access to resources. And now this is where we start to see a little bit more of an exacerbation of that vulnerability. Because traditionally, then this starts to become where it's often the females of the society that are excluded. And you can sort of see the intersecting of those inequalities. And as a consequence, as you go into the cultural causes, you start to see a pattern growing, which means that often the most vulnerable, the most excluded is someone who has a physical disability, who is over a certain age, who's female, who comes from an ethnic minority or faith minority, doesn't speak the language, a number of things. So as you can sort of see that this sort of aspect is to help us to understand that all 5 categories need to be looked at. But it requires a specific piece of work that needs to be done. Because when we talk about addressing inclusion and addressing exclusion and ensuring people are safe, we need to be talking about equitable distribution, not equality, equitable. Some of you may have seen this diagram that I've shown here. Right? So inequitable access does not address inequality. This is what you call equality. Everyone is given the same level of support. What you need to do is to provide equitable access, which is based on the needs of the person. You look at addressing their concerns. But ultimately, as we all know, it's not about just addressing the concerns of inequitable access. It is about addressing the causes and removing that inequality altogether. So in our work on this, even within a humanitarian setting, we're not only just looking at providing equitable access, but we need to also start to influence the causes and addressing inequity. And so this is where we talk about the continuum of inclusive programming, where we sort of say that if we really want to kind of address this, right, we need to move in the development sphere from what is exclusion to social inclusion, where no one is left behind, no one is left out, but we are addressing those vulnerabilities. Now, I just wanted to kind of maybe finish off with what does this mean for us, particularly within the Islamic sphere, on how we can address some of these things. Where does this come in to us, right? And it's important to kind of have this because, as you know, I'm sure you've been working on with Dr. Ubaidullah, you know, many communities where these things are happening are obviously Muslim communities. And it's also important to kind of have a faith lens to this, because faith is lived experience of this, of people who are affected by this. And it's important for us to have that context. And part of the context analysis is that faith element to it. And so it's important to kind of have an Islamic perspective on some of these issues on inclusion, exclusion, violence prevention, gender-based violence, you know, to ensure that we promote human dignity, we are protecting and non-discrimination that are there. And so what I would like to share is just some thoughts around what are some of the factors that we can think about from an Islamic perspective that frames a do no harm and appreciates diversity, that approach that is there. And so what we have here is just a couple of concepts. And so for the first concept is that when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about understanding intersectionality of diversity, the first thing that we kind of think about is that the concept of diversity, pluralism, human solidarity comes effectively through the principle of Tawheed, right? It's effectively that everyone is equal before God and then deserves equal recognition for their values and importance of their lives to society, as well as access to equal opportunities and God-given rights to fulfill their human potential. There's the hadith that says the believers in their mutual kindness, compassion, and sympathy are just like one body. When one of the limbs is affected, the whole body responds to it with wakefulness and fever. And we often use this, right? It's not something that is there particularly when we talk about solidarity within the Ummah. But what does this mean really in practice? This idea of diversity, pluralism, and brotherhood within the concept of Tawheed. Famous scholars say the Hussein Nasr sort of talks around Tawheed having two meanings: the state of unity or oneness, and the act of making one or integration. While the state of unity and oneness belongs to God only, God's creation participates in multiplicity. So at the level of diversity and multiplicity, the second meaning of Tawheed, that integration, connectedness, and unity, is that perspective of that talking about how do we connect as human beings, right? So we are reminded from the principle of Tawheed of the connectedness of everyone based on, despite our differences, calling us to kind of work towards that principle of wholeness and community. The second aspect of it is, the second factor is around protection, inclusion, dignity, sacredness of humanity through the principle of fitra. And again, this goes back to recognition that each human being has dignity and human life is valuable. It must be protected. And no harm must come to humans, as the traditions tell us. As the Quran tells us, if anyone saves the life of man, it is as if he has saved the whole of life. And that from the concept of fitra, every human being is created innocent, pure, true, and free, inclined to right and virtue, and endowed with the true understanding about his or her true nature. So this idea that fitra recognizes all humans are related. The Quran tells us about how we were created from a single person. So this idea of goodness being inherent in everyone is important. And so we have that trust, that responsibility, that irrespective of the diversity in which we've been created, we all created equal. And that it is all so sacred. The third element is around doing good, particularly through the concept of stewardship. And so when we talk about being inclusive and doing a do no harm approach, it is around precisely what I've been talking about, the involvement and social empowerment of community members, of the community, to do good, the responsibility to do good and to ward off evil, the promotion of the well-being of everyone, the equal distribution of income and wealth in the society. So it is important that we recognize that as stewards on this earth, that we have a responsibility to do good, to involve the community, So to involve the whole of the community, which means that no one can be left behind, no one can be left out. That we understand those times that no harm should be committed. Part of this as well is through principles of justice, ensuring equality and fairness. And justice is an integral part of ensuring that protection from violence, inclusion, respect of rights. And we are constantly reminded of standing up for justice. When we talk about inclusion and when we talk about ensuring that no one is left behind, we also do it from a principle of Rahman and Rahim in terms of our relationships, the humanization of the other person. Because often violence involves the creation of an enemy through the process of dehumanization, right, where the other is stripped of their human qualities. And that means that you can justify certain acts of violence, certain acts of exclusion on that community. So one thing that we need to be looking at is recognizing that as we go through this, we need to transform this relationship from one of enmity to peaceful existence, the rehumanization of the other person, recognizing God's mercy and compassion, bringing together the principle of the sacredness of life. And then the last one, from my perspective, is that this influences how we strive for peace. That we seek peace in all aspects of our life, for the ideal and peaceful and inclusive society that we want to create. And it's about transforming that enmity between communities. All of these things are not something that can be done overnight, and these are part of the process of your analysis and the work that you're doing. But I'm hoping that this will give you a good sort of framework for how we want to kind of contextualize this within an Islamic perspective, that is that. But in conclusion, I just want to kind of final kind of few words. That vulnerability is not you need to understand that vulnerability is context specific. It is determined by a number of factors. That each one of us has a different vulnerability need. So you cannot generalize and homogenize vulnerability. It has to be heterogeneous. We have to understand the variety of people that needs to be involved in any assessment, in any conversation, because their vulnerability will differ. We have to have that local understanding, that local context, that local perspective of exclusion, of inclusion, and those causes, and trying to figure out how do we address that. And in particular, from our perspective, and for today's conversation, I think it's around that there is an Islamic understanding of some of these things, and it's important that we use that, and we're not shy of using that to kind of frame some of these conversations. So I wanted to stop there and to thank you and thank Dr. Obaidullah and IBF for giving me the opportunity to come and to share a few thoughts. I hope they were quite useful, and I'm looking forward to conversation. I'm always a big fan, particularly in these settings, of conversations rather than presentations. So I will stop there, and Dr. Obaidullah, I will stop sharing so that I can see everyone's face. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Amjad, for a very insightful presentation. And you have very beautifully summarized the key takeaways from the presentation, but I'll try just to share some quick thoughts that, or the ideas that I could remember from his presentation. First of all, in humanitarian action, do no harm. That's the kind of minimum requirement. And for that, we need to do all humanitarian professionals. It is very important for them to do a contextual analysis. And as you said, there are 6 dynamics that may affect the context. And the most important one that you dealt with more elaborately was is financial and social inclusion, social exclusion. And we need to do a good analysis of, and also have a good understanding of the dynamics. Otherwise, we may end up, exacerbating the tensions that are already there. And you also spoke about inclusive programming, which is taken up to address this. And lastly, you ended highlighting the Islamic perspectives on this, tracing the Islamic roots of the conceptual ideas that we just discussed. The ideas in Islam which are very, very relevant here are, as you said, the concept of unity and brotherhood of Islam, the sacredness of life, and overall the idea that no one must be left behind. Let's see if we have any questions from the participants. If many participants, they usually join late, or they try to benefit from the recordings. And if we get questions, we make it a point to send them across to the speaker. So I see that there are no questions today. Well, here is one question. If you could just quickly address Dr. Amjad.
Yes.
Could you elaborate some sort of give examples from your wide experience of the type of harm that that aid can unintentionally cause in humanitarian situations, and what specific measures can organizations really take to minimize these adverse effects?
Yeah. Again, I mean, I can give some through some examples actually. You know, I mean, and not to say that it's something, but I think so. First and foremost is like I said, I think, you know, if you take a context where, for example, there's been a conflict in that country, and you know, I worked for many years in Sri Lanka, particularly during the time of the conflict. And in 2006, there was a drought in the northeast part of Sri Lanka, and that's a part where all three major communities are living. You have the Muslim community, the Tamil community, and the Sinhalese community. The Sinhalese community is a majority in Sri Lanka. And there was a drought, and there were no rains, and so that part of the country was stressed in any case in terms of resources and food and everything else. And the conflict restarted in that part of the country. And for those of you who know the history or may not know the history of Sri Lanka, there was a major conflict, particularly between 1983 to 2009, largely between the two major ethnic groups, the Sinhalese on one side and the Tamils on the other side. And that conflict started. Now, traditionally, because of the conflict, the Tamil community has been the one to have received a lot of the support and the aid from the international community, because they are the ones who have suffered. The Tamil community and the Muslim community to some extent because of the conflict. They have suffered from that conflict, so they were seen as the direct beneficiaries. When the conflict started again, aid agencies went in to kind of support those that were displaced by the conflict, largely Tamils and Muslims. But what they failed to properly understand was that that area was already stressed because of the drought and everything else. And so there were also Sinhalese communities. The majority community was also suffering, not necessarily because of the conflict, although they also became, as the conflict dragged on, they also became affected and they were displaced. But they were suffering because there was no food. And so you had a scenario where, and in that part of Sri Lanka, you have what you call Sinhalese villages, Tamil villages, Muslim villages like that. They don't live sort of with each other; they live next to each other. And you had a scenario where you had aid trucks going through the Sinhalese villages, taking aid to the displaced, to those affected by the conflict, to the Tamil villages, to the Muslim villages. And you have the Sinhalese villages who are also under pressure. So imagine you see this, right? You see all this aid going through your village to the village from another community. So that sparked off a certain level of resentment and exacerbated local tensions there, right? Because the humanitarian community hadn't fully appreciated that context. And so that can exacerbate those tensions, and that can lead to further tensions, further opposition. So it's important
How
to
do
kind
you
of
how do you sort of address this kind of, because this is a very serious issue that you're just mentioning about.
Yeah.
Must be a pretty big challenge for the humanitarian aid workers there.
It is. The way you address it is you have to recognize that this community also has it. Now, of course, there then becomes another challenge, that sometimes your back donors also don't recognize that concept, right? So you're given money to do something, and you go and do it, but you have to make a case to your back donors that this is also needed, right? We have the same thing even sometimes within the Islamic philanthropic perspective, right? Where we give zakat and sadaqah, and then we sort of say, well, actually, we just need to give it to the Muslim community, without recognizing that sometimes just giving to the Muslim community in an area where there's other communities, without them recognizing that this may exacerbate, can lead to that. I mean, I remember working again, in another part of the world where we were given money that was zakat that was there, and we were told you need to build water wells for these communities, but this community lives with other communities, and somehow we had a big kind of argument as to, we can't just, this whole area is suffering from lack of water, and they all deserve water wells, but you can't go into a Muslim community in that area and sort of say, we'll just build you water wells because the zakat is telling us it. So it is important for us to have that understanding. And you have to push back, right? We have to push back, but it also means having a better sense, a better understanding of the community, doing that analysis, right? And taking time to talk to people as well. Talking to the local community, asking them what are their needs, what are their concerns. So I think you have to have that balance.
I think recognition of the problem is kind of finding how the solution. So the fact that you realize that there is a problem here, like in zakat management, I think it's a serious problem that we come across almost on a daily basis. That who are the beneficiaries? Are they all belong to Muslim community, or on what basis you are distributing zakat to non-Muslims? So these are kind of questions zakat workers they face every day. So thank you very much, Dr. Amjad, for a very nice presentation and also beautifully answering these questions. And I think before we conclude, I just want to permit me to inform you about a program that we have, an ongoing program of certification for humanitarian professionals. I'm sure the students would benefit from today's webinar. And for those who are not non-student members or participants, I'd request all of you to spread the word about this formal system program where we systematically bring in such beautiful insights together for the benefit of the humanitarian professionals. So thank you, Dr. Amjad. Saleem, thank you so much. And thank you all the participants. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.